So here's our auger wagon. This is a case helix conveyor-matic. It's designed to be filled with feed in the hopper, hook it up to your tractor, run your auger out, and fill up a feeder out in the middle of the field. These augers and beaters turn, mixing the feed inside of the wagon. We have a hole cut in this vertical auger. Usually there's a little plate right there that you slide up, and it helps inspect the auger, clean out the bottom of the auger so it doesn't get filled with crud, and also inspect the bearing. The bearing that was in there holding the auger was shot. It was non-existent when I got it here. So what I ended up doing was pulling the auger out. I cut this open because the worm gear was in there and seemed like it was so seized to the shaft, it was going to be nearly impossible to get out by itself. And this was already kind of crusty and seemed like it was going to need to be replaced at some point, so I might as well replace it now. And it made it easier to cut a hole in the bottom of this auger and pull the whole auger shaft along with the worm gear out at one time, and then put a new piece of metal in here and reinstall it with a new bearing. You can kind of see with this lighting that there's another worm gear under here driven by the drive shaft. That worm gear connects to the worm gear on that vertical auger going up that tube, which makes it so that you can rotate this auger either to the left or to the right and unload on either side of this bin. Now it's actually in pretty good shape considering what it is, other than having to replace that auger bearing, and it does need some patching in the floor, but that's manageable. Now here is the auger itself, pulled out of that vertical tube. And this is the main problem that we're dealing with right now. So you can see here, here's our worm gear. That meshes with that worm gear on that horizontal shaft. And I had already started to clean this up a little bit just to see what I was working with. But what we need to do is get this cotter pin out, clean this up, and see if we can't get this worm gear off of this shaft. We need to be able to get this collar, or this part of the old bearing, off of this main shaft so that we can reinstall the new bearing that we have. It looks here like there was a set screw at one point, and also another part of this shaft has another hole for another set screw right there. Now there doesn't look to be much left on this set screw, and there doesn't look to be much on this set screw. You can tell, you can almost see down in there to the shaft. First things first, just getting our eye protection. Now you might ask, why are you doubling up on your eye protection? Well, if you've ever had to go into the emergency room and have a piece of metal removed from your eye with a needle, you'd probably start doubling up on your safety gear too. So this is what we're left with here. Cleaned up pretty good. It looks as if this bearing is actually part of this collar, and that they're separated by either a washer or some sort of spacer. Now this set screw either was never in there or it's just gone. Fell out, rotted out, rusted out. Doesn't look like there's anything there. Whereas this one looks like it's in there, and you can see where the grooves are for the Allen key, but I have a hard time thinking that I can put an Allen wrench in there and that it's going to come out on its own without stripping. The next step is going to be taking this cotter pin and seeing if I can remove this cotter pin from the shaft in one piece. If not, it's going to break apart. Whatever comes out, comes out. If it's flush with this keyway or flush with this shaft, then we're still able to pull this worm gear off of the shaft and then come back through and use a punch or a drill to get the rest of the cotter pin out from inside of the shaft. So what I'm going to start off trying to do is using a screwdriver or a punch to get that cotter pin out. More than likely, it's going to break. That's what my guess is. If it doesn't, it's a miracle. So we're going to come over here, going to grab maybe a screwdriver like that. I'm going to grab a small pair of vice grips. I already have a pair of needle nose pliers over there. And then try to grab a small hammer to see if we have to tap up on that. Now I might have to come back and grab a punch, but I'm going to start with this first. So I'm going to start with trying to squeeze the end of this cotter pin together. Get it as tight as possible. And it's still pretty separated here on the end. So we're going to get a pair of dikes here. Squeeze them, and just tap on the hammer, and it's sucking it in there a little bit. I'm just gonna give it a tap. The shaft might spin because it's not completely clamped down. See what happens when I give her a tap here. It's sucking down. Clean some of the gunk off in here. That way I can get my punch or screwdriver or whatever I'm going to end up using in here with as much bite as I can get. Now I ended up grabbing a punch. I'm going to try this. This one might be a little bit too big. Just what I thought. I'm gonna see if I can't punch these pieces out individually or not. I would assume probably not, but you never know. So since this cotter pin is not coming out, I'm just gonna break the pieces off of it best as I can here, and get them as close to the shaft as I can, so that way the worm gear will still come off, and then deal with getting the rest of this pin out after the fact, either with a punch or on the drill press. I'm going to use this chisel end to get this somewhat mushroom part down a little bit more if I can. So if you see here, I got that cotter pin busted off. Down here is almost perfect. It's inside of that keyway. Right here was the other part of the cotter pin. It's not completely smooth, but it should be smooth enough that this worm gear can come over this shaft and kind of wipe this clean, if you will. So here I have my puller. Might be a little messing around to get this on here properly since the end of the shaft isn't completely flat. Makes it a little bit more of a challenge. So here I got the pullers on. The hardest part about this is you can see this part of the shaft is worn down pretty good. So that point of the puller doesn't have a good spot to sit on because it wants to pull either which way because the end of the shaft isn't completely flat. And at this point in time, I don't feel like drilling a pilot hole in the end of the shaft for this to sit into. I may end up having to do that, but as of right now, I'm hoping I can get it off without going that far. More likely going to need a little persuasive heat. So before I even mess with it, I'm just going to heat it up a little bit. And here is that worm gear in the keyway. So the worm gear actually still looks to be in pretty good shape. Or then I put a couple of nicks into it when I was punching it off, but I'll grind those down and clean that up. Then I'll get inside of here and I'll clean this out really good before I put it back on. Same with the shaft, I'll clean the shaft off really good. Give it a little grease and see if we can't persuade that worm gear to go on there a little bit easier. Be the perfect time to see if I can't get this cotter pin out while it's still hot. Perfect. Nice. Next is to remove what's left of this bearing. Now we can go about this two different ways. Try to drill out that set screw in there the best we can, or I can come in here with the torch or a grinder and cut on either side of this bearing and just flop it off, cut it into two halves. Get in here with a chisel. Now I try to go up a little bit further to kind of cut the rest of that bearing a little bit to help get that off, but there's a part of that collar. And here we have this part of the bearing. You can either try to split it apart with this punch, or see if I can't work it back. I don't think that this is gonna work, but maybe going a little bit. So you could do the same thing, you get in here and you could cut this, cut it in half. If I use this edge. Perfect. I can see we got that collar off for the bearing and the bearing itself off. Cleaned it off a little bit with a wire wheel, but I'll probably have to come through here and clean it off a lot better with something a little bit more aggressive, because you can see it's pitting, which might make it a little bit tough to get the new bearing on. And over here we have our pieces of the puzzle. Our worm gear, our collar, part of the bearing, this little washer, and what was left of our cotter pin.